Hello, everyone. My name is Myra Artiles. I'm one of the PIs on the Rising Doctoral Institute grant. I am an assistant professor of engineering at The Ohio State University. And today I wanted to introduce you a little bit to the process through which we developed the Rising Doctoral Institute. So you're probably receiving a recording to this particular session before you attend the showcase in October. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First and foremost, we really want you to be familiar with where our research has led us and also how we've made those research findings into applicable choices that you can use in order to design the RDI. And we'll share a little bit about our own experiences along the way. We are going to be grounding on the research that is already existent, as well as at this point, over 8 years of research that we've been doing as a team, working with doctoral students as well as with first-year doctoral students and trying to understand what are the different mechanisms through which they are able to succeed in grad school, and how can we, as faculty and administrators, best support that so that all students have an equal opportunity to finish the engineering PhD. I will not be at the showcase, which is why I'm happy to host this session now online. I am going on parental leave this fall, but I'm including my email here. If you have any questions, we will be hosting virtual office hours in the spring, as I'm sure, other different types of support mechanisms. So please do not hesitate to reach out in the spring, and I'm happy to take meetings to help you figure out what is the best RDI content or best RDI curriculum for your institution and for your students. So a couple of things about the workshop we're about to get into. This was a recording that we hosted in the year 2022 for our original SILs. So you're going to see a lot of interaction and a lot of references to the specific 5 universities that started working with us. However, the goal that we're trying to work through with you this time around is to help you develop a list of the topics or a list of the workshops that your RDI should be based on in order to best meet the needs of your students. So based on the different conversations that you're going to be hearing over the next couple of days when you join us in DC, you want to be ready to start answering some of those questions of, I'm ready to host an RDI. I have a sense of who I want it to be for, but I don't know how to best meet their needs. That is what today's conversation is going to help you achieve. So with that, I'm going to let my former 2022 self guide you through the exercise and through the research, and I'll see you again at the end. So a quick outline. First, we're going to talk about how graduate students develop and what that process looks like, and why the RDI is critical for it to happen at the stage that we are hosting it, rather than a little bit later in the PhD. We're then going to talk about the impact of having students be misaligned in graduate school, and what is that going to make? How is that going to, I guess impact is still the right word, their decisions to whether stay or move forward in the degree or decide to depart early. Then we'll talk about the 5 main topics areas that we found were the most critical for students in the process, in particular for minoritized students in the process of getting the PhD. And then the last 2 is really going to be up to you. You should be able to find in your workbooks all the prompts for all the sessions we're going to go today, but the last 2 should really set you up to have the questions you need to go back home this week and ask, what is it that I have available to me? What is it that I need to go resource? What are the questions and what are the tasks I really need to do in order to set this activity up such that I can be successful? So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is a brief schematic of how graduate students develop. And so this is kind of a composite of a couple of different frameworks that describe the process through which students enter the doctoral degree, get familiar with the profession, and ultimately become independent researchers by the time they get to the end. And so the process is called socialization. It's how they internalize the values that we instill in graduate school that ultimately make them independent researchers. And so it starts at the anticipatory phase, which is the one that we focus on, and I'll explain that in a minute. And that is when students enter the PhD and they don't necessarily know what they've gotten themselves into. They don't necessarily have an idea of what to even expect. Typically, the information that they have at this stage comes from social media, perhaps a PhD comics, or some friend that might have gone ahead of them. and shared a little bit of that, but it's not necessarily based on any real knowledge of about what graduate school is like. Next up, students enter the program. This is semester one. They're starting, they're getting all of the information. And so they realize, okay, I know nothing, but I don't necessarily know where to go find that information. So the program is telling me all the things I need to do, all the milestones I need to work through, and I'm starting to absorb that and ask questions. From there on, the students become a little bit more established and they move on to what is the informal part of the socialization. And at this point, the students recognize they know nothing, but they also start recognizing the networks that really help them move forward and be able to get the answers to the questions that they need. They start learning the patterns that they can see with their peers that are more advanced than them. Okay, this is how a third-year student behaves. This is how a defense looks like. This is what I need to do in order to be able to get to there. And they start internalizing slowly but surely many of those roles. And this right here is the stage where a lot of students have trouble, in particular minoritized students, because if they don't have those networks, if they can't access that capital, quote unquote, that essentially gets them through to the next stage, this is where they can get stuck and often have some struggle in order to be able to get to the very end, which is where you internalize the values of the profession, you start becoming that independent researcher, you start behaving or taking ownership over what that means for you, and then finally be able to successfully defend the degree. So what the RDI aims to do is tackle a lot of the things that they're going to face in the 3 stages after at the very early stage. We know you know nothing. You may not be aware that you know nothing, but we are going to give you all of the information that you need such that by the time you get to these stages, you have some sense on how to tackle them. So this is why we call this an early information intervention. We're giving students the tools early, even when they don't think they need them, even when they're not aware they're going to need them, or what tools are there even available, in order for them to be able to get to those stages and be able to just pull out of their toolbox and say, okay, the RDI taught me how to do this. I think I can figure this out. So research has shown that when it comes to graduate schools, there's essentially 3 types of misalignments. And so what we define here as misalignment is any belief you may have entering graduate school that doesn't match the reality. And so there's 3 essential types per this paper by Holberg, which you'll have the full reference in your workbook. The first is task, and this is when what you think you will do doesn't necessarily match the task you're entitled to do, or when the scope of the task isn't necessarily what you thought it was going to be. And so an example of this is that we get many students that will start the PhD and they'll share, oh, I really just thought this was an extension of my undergraduate degree or my master's, and I had to focus on coursework. And so I put all my time on coursework, and later on I found, oh wait, the research matters more. The research it was put is what pays for my rent and what makes my advisor happy and what ultimately is going to keep me here, because the research is the big thing I need to turn in the end. And so this is a misconception or a misalignment between what I believe the task was and what the task actually was. The next one we see often is a misalignment in the university. And so what essentially happens here is that students often don't quite understand the role of the supervisor or the advisor in this case. And so we see students that they think they go in and do their own thing and have the advisor act as an academic advisor, somebody who occasionally gives them some feedback, but doesn't necessarily dictate what their next step is, isn't somebody that you work closely with. And it isn't until they make a misstep in the relationship a little bit later on down the road that they realize, oh, wait, this person is a lot more vested in my success than I am. And I probably should have paid more attention to that relationship, because in reality, they're my supervisor. They're not just somebody I can pick and choose what advice they give me. And this is especially true in the case of engineers, because in the case of engineers, we practice the model of science advising, the science model of advising. And so the student and the advisor are not just a person, the relationship is not just somebody who gives me advice on how to progress in my degree, but rather is also my co-author. Oftentimes my employer is also a collaborator. And by the time they end, the relationship becomes a lot more equal than you would see perhaps in a humanities PhD. And so being aligned in what that supervision relationship has to be is a very important step that students need to be able to overcome in order to not burn the bridges that are ultimately going to get them to be finished. Then finally, the third type of misalignment that you can see is the personal misalignment. And we see this a lot, in particular with minoritized students, because students come into the degree thinking that they may want to do this for their family, for their community, and then they realize exactly what the cost is. It's not just a financial cost, it's often a time cost. And it's going to come at the expense of being able to see my family as often as I want to, or being as close to my family as I want to. And we see this a lot with Latino students who may have to be very far away from their families. And that's not always something that they desire in their values when choosing grad school. And so they know that the degree is going to be a fulfilling and rewarding experience. But then in reality, it's really just one big challenge they have to learn to overcome. And they have to make amendments, or I guess they have to reconcile essentially with their personal values. And so what we do in the RDI is we tackle these three misalignments through a series of worked topic areas, which is what we're going to talk about today. And so we tackle each of them separately, but we also talk about these across topic areas such that students understand maybe what I think graduate school is going to be isn't reflective of the reality that I'm going to face. And so they come in at the very least primed to be able to change their mind about what they're expecting. And when they have that malleability instilled early on, they can be more likely to make the necessary changes and adjustments to be able to succeed. It doesn't mean that we're going to save them from every possible strife, but we're at the very least giving them the tools that they can change their mind, adjust direction earlier rather than later. And so this is what the research essentially shows happens when students are misaligned with graduate school. So if students are a fit, then it's all good. They're a fit, they can move forward. But sometimes the students can't be a fit, be it because of the values, the direction graduate school is taking them, or even just in the supervision relationship. And so they can either learn to live with it or choose to say, I can't live with this. This is something I'm going to need to address. If they learn to live with it, that's fine. They can move forward. They made their adjustments, they made their compromises, and they can continue in the degree. However, when they can't live with it, that's where it can become a problem depending on what pathway they choose. So many students, and we see this quite often, choose to not address the problem, either because they don't want to upset the status quo. They think I can probably get away with it, but in reality, they don't. They may not have enough information to be able to address it. And when they don't do this, typically this leads to negative motivational outcomes. And what this means right here is essentially that these students aren't going to be as compelled to continue. They're not going to have enough of a motivation to be able to make that degree progress, to seek the information they need in order to be able to progress, or even make the adjustments they need in order to be able to keep going. Some students choose to address the problem, and there's different nature of problems. We don't have to get into the details, but here's a reference if you want to learn more about this model here. And sometimes when they address the problem, they can find a positive solution or a temporary solution or no resolution, depending on the outcome of that type of addressing that they do. And depending on the nature of the problem, again, we can fall into a trap where the students don't necessarily have the right motivation to continue doing the PhD. And again, if the student chooses to stop addressing the problem, obviously they're not a fit, they know they can't live with it, they're going to choose to not stay. And that's what we're trying to avoid here. Given the stats that we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks and what we know, we're trying to put students in a position where they can learn how to address the problems or learn to live with the problems. And if they're aware of what might be coming their way early on, they can start making some proactive decisions in that direction. This isn't to say that students have to completely meld to the culture of that institution. They can choose to be counter spaces, but they have to understand what the implications are. And that's what we try to do. Okay, so we're finally gonna get to the topic areas. These are the 5 main areas that we found that students needed the most help in, or at least that students in the later stages of the PhD described as being, these were the things that took me some time to learn to manage. and I want to be able to get better at that. The first is doctoral program management, and we're going to jump into all of these in a lot of detail today, and you're going to be able to go and figure out which one of these topic areas does my institution already cover. And so the first is doctoral program management. Next up is advising and interpersonal relationships in grad school. Then we have day-to-day strategies for graduate school success. And this is, how do we manage my time? How do I get about those things those decisions that I make on a daily basis that ultimately add up to what I become as a PhD student. Next up, there's being minoritized in graduate school, and how do I handle those types of relationships and those types of issues when they do happen, because they will happen. It's not a matter of if, it's really just a matter of when. And if I'm prepared for it, I can have that conversation and have the language that can help me get out of whatever situation I might be in. And then finally, life post-PhD. And this one is particularly important, and we'll share a little bit on how you might want to tackle that and things you want to think about for what is specific to your institution. And so to kind of give you a little bit of a background on where all of this information came from, as you all know, the Dissertation Institute has been running for close to 6 years now. And as part of that, we've been doing research with the students, as well as their advisors, as well as other advisors who helped us design the Dissertation Institute. So we're talking here over 60 interviews, one-on-one with students, dozens of focus groups, dozens of interview with faculty. And it was all trying to understand, what is it that you would have wished your students would have known earlier? What is it that you would wish your students would be able to do at certain stages of their PhD? And so this information really helped us pin down the areas where both students and faculty agreed, this is where growth needs to happen. And the sooner we can get to it, the better. And so in 2019, we conducted our inaugural RDI. So this was before the big grant started, and we wanted to test, is this a thing that even works? Do we really have a sense here of what we're doing? And so we tested these 5 topic areas, and I'm going to share today what we did then, what we changed for the 2021 version, and a little bit of the detail on how we kind of got to that change and what the student feedback was when we did that change. So if you want to read more detail on how we got to here, the ASCE paper that we've shared with you should be able to give some of that information. But again, always happy to chat about this offline. Okay, so topic area number 1, and this is doctoral program management. And what the research has shown is here is that students enter graduate school with not a clear understanding of what a PhD is and what it ultimately can be used for, and that's going to impact whether they choose to stay or whether they choose to leave. And so a separate section here that we found that again relates to the overall program management is that which funding type students have is going to dictate which traits they leave graduate school with. It's not the same to have been a TA for 5 years and to have been a research assistant for 5 years, but also how each student individually manages each of these appointments that they have will ultimately impact how well they get to do. In the case of URM specifically, they're making investments that go beyond the financial. They're making investments about family and time. And on occasion, they have to send some money home. And what does that mean for you as a student? And so being able to have those conversations that go beyond the financial, but also a little bit into the emotional is important as you're managing how you progress in your doctoral program. And then finally, we talk a little bit about how choosing a doctoral advisor, how that very first decision that you make in graduate school is really complex and how you can get to tackle it in a way that ends up working for your success. So we talked about these topics relating to the overall doctoral program management in 3 different ways. The first was a session that was a high-level overview of getting off to a good start in grad school. And so the idea here was that you understood what the degree is, what the purpose of engaging with the research and the classwork and the advisor, how does that all build together, and what things I can do in order to be able to be successful long-term. The next one was a section on funding. And over here, we talked about an overview of what it means to be funded. Most of the students in engineering tend to be funded overall. And so we never had a conversation with any of our RDI students where they were lacking funding or self-funding, it was often a question of, I have an RA, what do I do with it? I have a fellowship, what does this mean? And so I was describing to them what were the responsibilities that you wanted to be mindful about and how to keep the funding that you have. And then finally, we talked about selecting an advisor and a committee. And so this is really just about the factors to consider in both processes. And so a little bit of the things that we learned was that this was a really good space to talk about milestones and what are the adequate extent support systems that can be available in your campus. And so when we talked about getting off to a good start in grad school, students by the end, they had an understanding of what the degree was, but oftentimes they were wondering, okay, how does this work in my campus? How does this work in my institution? And so right here, this session can be one that you can really work together with the grad school in order to be able to make very detailed and very specific to what your institution needs. Next up in the funding session, the students appreciated, they wanted to talk about it. They appreciated the specific descriptions and operationalizations of what the funding mechanisms were. However, in our case, because we had students from many different institutions, it was difficult to describe what does it mean to be an RA at Penn State? What does it mean to be a TA at FIU? So having somebody that can speak to that can speak to the specific opportunities in your engineering college can be very useful here. The students really wanted that specificity that in a generic RDI, we were not able to provide. So that's one thing that you want to be thinking about. And then finally, in selecting an advisor and a committee, you want to be considerate of the different processes that each department has. Some students do come in with an advisor already in mind, whereas other programs, they might wait up to a year in order to go to the selection process. And so you want to be factoring that as you design these sessions and understand what are the rules at my institution, what are the rules in the different programs that the students that are coming to my RDI encompass. One thing that we found to be particularly useful here was that students appreciated analogies where they could relate to what exactly did it mean to be an advisor? What exactly did it mean to be a committee? Because none of them necessarily had a PhD before, and statistically speaking, it was very likely that nobody in their family had either. Any type of metaphor that could help them connect the dots to the role of the supervisor and the role of the committee was really helpful. I gave the session myself. I used a Marvel analogy, and apparently that really resounded with the students to try to understand the Marvel characters and those relationships as to what it means to build a committee and what type of personalities do I need to be looking out for. And so based on the positive feedback that we did between 2019 and 2021, we didn't really make any changes here because none of the changes that the students wanted were ones that we will be able to make, which is making it more specific to them and their institutions.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So I feel like students are very focused on getting funding, right? That's kind of their top priority. I'm going to be sure I have all the funding. Did you ever approach the topic of, balancing that with finding the right advisor?
Not together. And the reason why was because we don't have specifics of their institution and how that can build. But that could certainly be something that you think about as you move forward, designing this for your institution, thinking about how that connects.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely. But that's a great point, because sometimes they do come quite tightly, and that matters.
So my question is, most of these elements affect almost every graduate student. Mm-hmm. So I'm just trying to separate, what affects the URM more than the other students. And, should we focus on certain aspects of it because they're in a minority group relatively? Would that affect them more in some of these aspects? I don't know if anyone has looked into that specific areas, for example.
Yeah. So, and that's a great question. It's a question that we certainly ask ourselves all the time. And I think that there's no clear-cut answer to that, because the reality is that, yes, a lot of these issues will affect a lot of students beyond your minoritized population. That being said, what statistics really show is that minoritized population are more likely to be impacted by these. And the reason why is because they lack the capital. They don't always have family members. They're actually less likely to have family members who would have engaged with the PhD, to have connections to mentors who would be able to walk them through that process. And this isn't to say that all minoritized students suffer this. And this isn't to say that all non-minoritized students, including international students, wouldn't be able to wouldn't also share some of these traits. But these groups are more likely to not do that, to share these traits, and are less likely to finish because of this reason. And so we're taking a statistically informed approach here, but agreed, many of these topics will impact most of your students. Topic area number 2, and this is perhaps one of the most important ones, is advising and interpersonal relationships in grad school. And as we all know, the advisor is the most critical relationship that you're going to build and sustain in grad school, and learning how to handle that is very critical in order to be able to stay and succeed long-term. But also it goes beyond the advisor, and students need to be aware of some of the broader departmental politics and the environment that they are in. And minoritized students in particular tend to struggle with this awareness because they might, again, not have that capital and those networks within the university that can help them be aware or even have a sense of what might be happening in the broader departmental culture. And we saw this a lot in students that either started a relationship with an advisor and then it turned sour because they made some decisions that they didn't know how they would impact them in the long term. But we also saw this at the broader departmental level with students who had difficulty navigating those broader relationships. They didn't understand how important the committee relationship was. They didn't understand how networking would have been critical to get them a job by the time they were done. And so we identified a specific need here for understanding what does it look like for me to be a good citizen of not just my research lab, but also my department, and to the extent necessary, the bigger institution in which I am. And so the way we tackled this was in 2 sessions. We had one session that was specific to establishing and maintaining a healthy advising relationship. And so this was essentially an overview on how to get there. We learned a big lesson with this session. The first time we hosted it, we did it, this was a 2019 version. It was a session where we posed potential scenarios to students and they would listen, okay, so what happens when my advisor tells me, I don't want to send you to this conference? And while this was a scenario that senior students would have appreciated more, junior students didn't necessarily even understand, wait, my advisor can choose to not send me to a conference, or my advisor can choose to add me to a paper or not add me to a paper. And so potential scenarios here didn't really resound with junior students because they didn't quite understand the nature of the relationship yet. And so we made a switch between 2019 and 2021, where we, instead of posing potential scenarios, operationalized in a very lecture style. This is what your advisor means. This is what your advisor does. This is what you get to do. And this is things to watch out for in your advising relationship. So we saw that students, their gains were significantly more in what they learned when we switched it to a more operational form of describing what is the role of the advisor and what they do, and how I as a student can take control of that relationship. And then relating to the broader departmental structure, we had the second session called Tips from the Top. And what this was essentially was an open and honest question and answer session with some of the leadership in our team. So as you know, Dean Stephanie Adams is part of our leadership team, as well as Dr. Holly Matisovich. And so what students wanted to hear here was, you've been in the academy for a very long time. You've seen it all pretty much. How can I get over X, or how can I get over Z? And this is where students introduce their own personal possible situations. This is where the scenario and role playing really played in. But what made it different from the establishing and maintaining healthy advising relationship session was that students got to define what were those possible scenarios they could foresee. And then our leadership team would be able to step in and answer how to tackle that. So what you want to be thinking about here for your institution is, who might be the open door that I can give students access to? Who might be that leadership face that can be a friendly face to them? And that way you make the whole hierarchical structure of your College of Engineering more accessible to your students. You give students a face that they can relate to, and the process becomes significantly more friendly and familiar. as they move on. And so, like I said, based from the 2019 to 2021 feedback, no changes were really made to the content. The topics we shared were the topics the students needed, but yes to the structure based on where the students were at and what their expectations were. I think one thing I'll add was that for the session with tips from the top, what the students particularly appreciated was being able to hear from other students and what their questions were. This helped to reduce the imposter syndrome because they were able to say, oh, I had that concern, but so did they, so I'm not alone. And so that became really valuable. This is one thing that you might want to do similar to like a fireside chat type of structure, nothing particularly formal, because again, what you're trying to do is break down some of those barriers and help students ask their questions in a judgment-free environment.
I guess I was assuming that we as facilitators might be those with the open doors going
Absolutely.
through. And so what you're saying is that there should also be someone kind of higher up in the administration that also has that open door?
So I don't know that the person higher up in the administration has to have the open door, but at the very least for the session, they should become a more friendly and accessible face. I don't expect the dean to always be available to any complaint, concern from the student or any question, but certainly be present in that conversation, become somebody beyond the face on the brochure, and just break down some of that hierarchical barriers. Holly, I think you wanted to add something and unmuted earlier.
Yeah, another piece to think about those two might be like an outside perspective in that conversation too, because sometimes, having students that were spread across the country, we were separate from drama issues, whatever, at individual sites. So students could bring, like in some ways we were a safe space because of that, because we were not directly connected to anybody's institution. So I think, and that perhaps mattered more for Dissertation Institute, where students were farther along and had more questions and more experiences. But I think this is where it's important to think about who your population is and who might be the right 2 or 3 voices to be in that conversation. Because if you have a lot of first-generation college students, you might do, or first-generation PhD students, you might, for example, do better to get somebody that comes from a similar background that they might feel comfortable talking with. And so I think, so sorry, I'm not very organized in my thoughts, but having Stephanie as a dean was fabulous. It was also fabulous because she was not their dean. So I see Myra's point that having their dean could be fabulous, but it also was nice that dean, not my dean, so I don't have to worry about looking stupid and having that track with me for the whole time I'm at the university.
I think that another, like the degree of separation institutional wise can be good, but also department wise. You don't necessarily want to have their department chairs or their potential advisor in the room for this type of conversation. So think about the different degrees that you can have there. But yeah, good point, Holly. Topic area number 3 is what we call day-to-day strategies in grad school. And again, here it's more about the shift for students who are coming from either a coursework master's only or straight from undergrad into the PhD, and they don't necessarily understand how they're being assessed now, which is a completely different ballgame. It's not just the coursework again. And I have to start thinking about that hidden curriculum or those things that are not as explicit to me. That is what now dictate my day-to-day life in graduate school. And how can I become a better self-manager? My time is now a lot more open. I'm not taking 5 classes as I was in undergrad. So what does this mean for me? An additional thing here is the writing process. And this is where we got to learn a lot about this students in this stage. Writing for engineers in general can be particularly challenging because we're not essentially taught how to write. At least we have to learn and pick that skill up once we're in the dissertation process or when we're in the process of writing publications with a research group. And so how students develop these skills can be pretty critical in order for them to make progress in that day-to-day that ultimately adds up to the bigger, broader degree progress. And so the way we tackled this misconception was through 3 sessions. The first was managing time and procrastination. And this was essentially an overview on strategies at both the degree level, so high level, when do I want to graduate? How do I backtrack my milestones into that? But also on a daily level. I woke up, what do I do in the next hour in order to be efficient? What am I going to do this week, this semester? in order to be able to get to where I want to go. And so what students appreciated in this session was very specific strategies that they can go back home tomorrow and implement. So many of the things that we did weren't necessarily go have this bigger conversation about when do you want to graduate. Yes, we did do that. But a lot of what we did was also track your time this week, see how you spend it, make a list of what you want to do, assign it a time on your calendar, be dependent on these different day-to-day strategies that can really get you to be successful, not just in the long term, but also in this week, and you can end the week on a win. And so students really like those things that they can take home and go practice immediately. The next session that we had, and this was where we learned a lot, writing during graduate school. And the main goal of this was for students to get over all the drama that you see around writing, of writing sucks, writing is difficult. As an engineer, I cannot do this. I was not built to do this. And all of that struggle in order for them to just be able to engage with writing and go write. And now we had a session on this in 2019, and we were giving students prompts in order to be able to start writing paragraphs, tips and tricks about the structure of what a paper might look like. And the students appreciated that. But perhaps this was because we were running it alongside the Dissertation Institute. The students said, but I wanted time to write. And we were thinking, but you are not in grad school yet. What are you going to write? So they really wanted to engage with the writing, but didn't necessarily have something to write. And so while the strategies were useful, they didn't necessarily know what to do with that. And so I think by the time we analyzed all our data, the conclusion was, yes, this session can be helpful, but it's more helpful when students are in a more advanced stage of the PhD, not necessarily right when they're going to start grad school, because they're not going to be writing for a while there, at least not necessarily. However, we did offer a more extended version of this second session here, which is engaging with the literature. And so in this case, we talked to students about how to find papers, how to read papers, but also how is the literature made? What does that publication process look like? And so for both years here, we've brought Dr. Susan Lurd, who's an associate editor of the Journal of Engineering Education. And she's been able to give students a really nice breakdown of what the process looks like from her perspective as an associate editor. So I get the paper. These are the reviews that come back. These are the things that you want to be thinking about when you get your reviews. And so by the time this session was done, students, even though they were very early in the program, hadn't necessarily engaged with writing, they can go into the literature, find a paper and say, okay, this is a piece of literature, but this is the process it went through to get to here. And so this is what I need to be thinking about as I go into the research lab. How do I get my data in to get to what this piece of paper looks like? And how do I get to the 3 or 4 that I need to be able to finish by the time I'm done? And so based on the feedback, we essentially eliminated the writing session that focused on strategic things they want to do engaging with writing, but rather kept it at a broader level of this is how you make the literature. This is how you want to think about the feedback that you get from reviewers. And this is what it means to read a paper. So some resources you want to think about here is engaging with the library. That way you can be specific on how you can help students think through how to search the literature at your institution, the specific tools that might be available. Bringing in folks from the writing center can be useful, not to teach them how to write again, but to teach them these are the support systems that you have available here. If you have a writing center that does help graduate students. And if you have a faculty member that is in some sort of editorial board for a journal, or perhaps the editor of a journal, they can help clarify what that process looks like in order to be able to develop literature for students. So those were the things that students valued here as the primary outputs of what the PhD ultimately is, which is publications to a fair extent. And so the next topic area is, what does it mean to be minoritized in graduate school? And what we know here, and should be fairly obvious by now as we've been talking about this to an extent, is that minoritized doctoral students often experience imposter syndrome, but also a lack of belongingness. And this has to do with the fact that they often don't see people like them on campus. They don't see people like them in the professoriate. They may not have those family connections of people that have pursued this PhD in engineering. Statistically speaking, they are a lot less likely to face this. At the very least in the PWIs, this might look differently for some of the minorities serving institutions, so we acknowledge that. But often this can translate into mental health complications for students and can impact their doctoral degree progress. And so what we aim to achieve in these sessions is developing awareness, but also creating support groups for students, helping them figure out, what is this going to look like for me? What am I going to need in advance in order to be able to succeed? If I am aware that this is going to be difficult for me because of this, how can I be proactive towards feeling and finding a space and making my own space in academia where I can belong and stay? And so the way we tackled this was through 3 different sessions alongside something else that we're going to talk about in a minute. So the main 3 different sessions was finding balance, navigating engineering doctoral programs while enhancing cultural capital. And that's a mouthful of a title. But essentially what we're teaching students in this session is, this is who you are. This is what you bring to the table. These are your identities. How can you make them work for you? How can you reconcile them with where you are at in the PhD, and how you can figure out a place where you belong and make the PhD something that still adds value to you without having to absolutely compromise everything you believe in or assimilating to a culture that isn't your own. And so that's what that session essentially entailed. The next one is mental health in graduate school. And this wasn't a talk that we do. We actually hire a mental health professional to come and have this conversation with them. We're happy to share some of those resources with you. But this is probably a really good space for you to leverage the mental health facilities that you may have on campus. That way you make it known to the student, this is a thing that we have that can work for you. This is a thing you can use. And it's right here on your campus. And so again, breaking down some of those barriers of access. And then finally, the last one that we're going to list here is one-on-one coaching sessions. Throughout the week of the RDI, we made ourselves available to the team. And in case you've not noticed, our team is very diverse when it comes to engineering. So we were able to identify with different students based on different similar backgrounds. We made ourselves available, not just in the sense of here's our time, but also just put ourselves out there. This is who I am. This is where I'm from. These are the things I've lived in the academy. I'm always happy to chat about them. And so one thing I personally did, I always talked about how I started the PhD once and didn't finish because it was not the right fit for me or the right school for me at the time. And so that helps students think, okay, quitting is not something that is completely out of this world. Somebody has been through that before, but they still got their PhD later on in something else. And so having those conversations and being open and vulnerable to them to the extent that you feel comfortable doing so can be really good at breaking down those barriers and providing some support to the students. Another thing that we're not going to talk about in detail today, I'm not really sure when we're going to talk about it, but at some point we will, is that we had group sessions at the end of each day with the students. And so this is what we call the success groups. The success groups are essentially a focus group, and the students get to do the driving. At the end of each day, after they covered a handful of sessions, we would meet with them as a group and we would talk with them. Okay, what did you learn today? What did you process? What questions do you still have about what the different sessions were about today? And so this was not in a large group. This was in a smaller group. 4 to 5 people tend to be a pretty good number for this. Anywhere beyond 7, it can get up to be a little bit too large of a group for students to share some of their concerns. But what students would really appreciate from that was building relationships with each other that they could leverage beyond the RDI. We'd still check up on them pretty much every month since the RDI ended and just follow up on, okay, you're in month 9 of your PhD. What is it looking like for you now? What things are you struggling with now? Or what things have been going well for you? How has the RDI set you up for success now? And that helped create peer relationships with other minoritized students. And so they felt a little less lonely as they walk through into the PhD, especially in that first year, which can be so critical. So that's one thing you want to think about, how to set up at your own institutions. And so based on the feedback, there were no real changes made here from 2019 to 2021, other than the success groups, instead of happening on just once at the end of the week, they happened every day, and we followed them through that entire first year to keep that scaffolding going as the students settled into their day-to-day PhD. One thing that you want to be considering here is who becomes your facilitators. And the reason why, and I'll say this plainly, it's not the same to have a white person come and talk to a Black or a brown student about mental health without acknowledging the stigma within the communities that can exist. And so one thing you want to be thinking about here is, how do I break those barriers between ethnic and racial identities when it comes to talking about feeling like I belong, or feeling like I am probably starting to lose my grip on the PhD, or having a coach that has been through the same experience I have. So you want to be very intentional in who your facilitators are, in particular for these sessions in this topic area. With that, we'll move to the last topic area we have found in this data set, and this is life post PhD. And so what we know from the literature and what we know from some of the more recent reports from the Council of Graduate Schools is that over 70% of engineering and in general STEM doctorate holders do not go into academia. But the process through which you get to a PhD, what you're being socialized to do is essentially become a professor. You learn the publication process, you learn the grant writing process, and that might not necessarily reflect all the career options that are possible. In fact, it doesn't reflect 70% of them. So what we want to show students here, yes, academic careers are a possibility, but there's more to that. And there's more that you can achieve beyond what the status quo can be. And the way that we tackled this in particular was through a session. One session that was career options with the PhD. And so we talked about the academic rung of jobs that you could possibly pursue when you're done, both in the tenure track position as well as the teaching track, but also some administrative roles that students can consider. And this was very useful because the students got to learn not just where can I go when I'm done, but who are all these people that I'm talking to this week? Who are all the different people that are in my department? What do these titles mean? I chose an assistant professor. What does this mean for me in comparison to my peer sitting next to me who chose a full professor? And starting to break down some of those academese jargon that we really see. We also, in some of the years, we've brought industry professionals to talk a little bit about different things that they can do outside of the academy. But what you want to be mindful here is that there's industry and there's industry. They can go into government positions, so you want to be thinking about how to leverage that. They can go into national lab. They can go into private research industry. So thinking about how to do this, how it matches best your institution, and leveraging your alumni can be really useful here. One thing that we always find is that students always want more time with this session. This session tends to be the one that stirs up the most questions. And so you might want to consider splitting between academia and industry, or jobs in ALT-AC in general, or whatever makes sense for how your group of students. I think one thing you want to be careful here is that it can be easy for you to think, oh, I can leverage the placement office at my institution. And while that might work for some cases, you want to think about how equipped are they for PhD seekers, for PhD students. So they might be very good at helping engineers find job in private industry after an undergraduate or a master's, but they might not have a clear sense on how to help your students go into a tenure track position. So this is where you just want to be careful on who you bring in and make sure that you're giving students a breadth of experience. Okay, so enough talking from me. This is where you each get to jump in with your institutional partners, or on your own if you do not have a partner at the moment. But in your workbooks, you're going to find these 5 topic areas alongside questions such as these for each. And so what I want you to think about here is the following. What resources did spring out of the top of my head when she was talking about career options? This is who I thought could totally do this. Or I know this faculty who gives a great advising relationship session. What things exist already on your campus that you can leverage and bring in? So that's the first question. Or what sessions am I offering through a different workshop or camp that might tackle some of these topic areas and I can also tweak? So think about, what do you have already available? So you also want to think about, if I am using existing resources, do they cover all of the areas that we discussed today? And if not, how would I have to tweak it? How many sessions do I have to do in order to be able to fully cover any particular topic? We're not asking you to do exactly what we did. This is supposed to work for you and your institution. So think about, perhaps the one about careers, I can break it down into 3 because I have 3 different sessions that are offered across campus that I can leverage here. Or maybe the one about advising in politics, I can build into 1 because I know of somebody that does these together. So think about just what resources do you have and how you can best leverage that. If you don't have a workshop that already exists in your institution for any specific topic, think about who might be able to facilitate that conversation. Who might be somebody you might want to tap. And then finally, if you can't think of any resources at your institution for any one specific area that you want to cover, which external collaborator, it could be us here on the team, and we'll talk about that, I believe, next week, probably in more detail, or sorry, in one of the couple of next weeks in more detail, or somebody I know from the grapevine, from the field, who might be able to help me figure out where to go with this topic. So other considerations to think about. Are there other needs in my institution? Have I found in working with graduate students that these topic areas aren't as comprehensive as I need them to be, or perhaps some of them might just not match the needs of my students? What else can I add? So the RDI, the length is yours to determine. The topics are yours to choose. We're giving you a skeleton based on what we found has been useful, but you get to tailor that to what you need. So think about, is there anything else that I need? What resources can you think you might want to include that you already have, but don't necessarily fall into the topic areas that we've talked about today? Also, again, is there a way to tweak existing resources to meet your needs?
So with that, hopefully you have a sense now on how we built our RDI and the steps that we're going to be taking during the showcase to make sure that you are building an RDI that isn't just what the research is saying, but rather what you can apply best to your institution and your students. We will provide all of the questions shown in today's slides in the form of a handout during the showcase, and we're going to give you plenty of time for you to work through them alongside the different PIs in the project and the prior SIL collaborators who are going to be sharing a little bit about their own experiences in building their RDI. So don't worry about not having the questions and not having the answers immediately when you step into the door, as we are going to guide you through the exercise when you meet with us in Washington. So with that, my name is Myra Artiles, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have via my email below, artiles.2@osu.edu. Thank you.